we good? Oh, okay. Good. So yeah, I'm going to do that. I'm probably going to stop and ask questions at various points just to clarify, and wave your hands or something if you can't hear me at some point. So it won't be clean as all that, but it'll more or less be. I want a lot of time at the end to talk as far as y'all want to talk. So yeah, what I just want to talk about or been asked to talk about, I'm happy to do, is something I've been working on for 5 years or so. And so it sort of has come in and out of the news at various points for various reasons as I've worked on it, which has been stressful. And so the book's about to come out, cut in stone. I just got a copy, so I'm excited to see it like in existence. And so it just happened to sort of be on people's minds again right now for clear reasons. I think that's sort of we should expect that, as we'll get into some later, that I think Confederate monuments sort of signal deeper ideologies and problems of our society, and insofar as they remain up, they're going to continue to attract that kind of attention so long as they are there. So it's not something that we should be surprised by, that they will kind of continue to go through these sorts of cycles. So what I want to do just simply is kind of just give an intro to why theology, particularly Christian theology actually, and Confederate monuments, the what and why of using Christian theology to analyze and then hopefully disrupt Confederate monuments and what they represent, with plenty of times for questions. But I want to start with a question, if that's okay. Just like what is, and if y'all want to talk about it or whatever, that's fine. But about what your experiences are with or memories are of Confederate monuments in general. I can remember my earliest memories of them, going up to Richmond with my dad at some point to see the Lee statue, and I didn't really know Raleigh had one for a good long time, even though I was raised there from the age of 3. So I was curious about that. And what are y'all's memories of those, or what are your reaction to them, and how has that changed over the years? Just curious. So yeah.
So you should be able to unmute yourself if you'd like to make a comment.
Well, I grew up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and on the side of Stone Mountain is a huge carving. I don't know. It was always there. I don't know that I've really thought that much about it until recent years.
Yeah.
What is the Raleigh monument that you referred to, Ryan?
Oh, there's a few, but the one I was referring to was the one on the state capitol grounds, 1895 was when that one was put up.
And so what's right there. What is it a monument of? Is it a ordinary soldier, or is it some general or something?
I'll talk about it later, but it's a common soldier statue. And so, yeah, it's just meant to signal just the common soldier. Those are two main types that were dedicated around in that period of time when Confederate monuments were put up. Ones were the generals, but the most common was this common soldier. So that's the one that's there. It's different because most common soldier statues tend to be lower to the ground a bit, and the Raleigh one is 90 feet up in the air or something like that. No one's pulling that thing down without killing themselves.
Is it the one on the north side of the Capitol?
I don't know the ordinals, but it faces First Baptist. I know it's like just you're white First Baptist and you're right there at the monument. Yeah.
Okay.
The black First Baptist is on the other side of the Capitol ground. There's a history there, as you can imagine.
So the monument that I'm most familiar with is Silent Sam at Chapel Hill.
Yeah.
And we never gave it any thought while I was at Chapel Hill. And in fact, the only thing that probably most of us knew was the joke about Silent Sam. The only time he shoots his gun off is when a virgin walks by, which is, of course, he's always silent. That was the joke at Carolina.
Okay, that was pretty sexist.
Yeah, well, like I said, we never really gave it much thought beyond the joke, the running joke. Of course, having now been away from there and be much more enlightened, obviously I think different about that statue now.
I was gonna share something I shared with Ryan. My twin brother went to the University of Richmond, and the first time that I visited him up there, one of the things we did was to go see Monument Avenue, and I think now I would have a much different. I don't know that I would have a desire to go and see that, but thinking, not really thinking in terms of the meaning behind the monuments, but just looking and being impressed by pretty statues in an old, on an old Southern boulevard. And, it's amazing to think, now many years later, my opinions have changed.
Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Oh, okay. I remember as a child, visiting different places on walking tours, and I just remember how imposing they were. I mean, they were so huge that it's like I cowered a little bit walking around them. But what I would notice is the horses, because most of them were generals on horses, and I would pay attention to the horses, and I didn't care about those old guys sitting up there with their weapons or whatever. So it was, I noticed, but certainly never took anything to heart to think things through as a young person.
Okay. Well, anyone can just wave their hand at any point. That's funny. That's true about like Silent Sam. You're not noticing it until you do, or Bob, your story in Richmond. That's how they work. I mean, that's how everything works. And that's nothing wrong with that even. I mean, that's just kind of how human attention works. Something is not noticed for years and years, and then something happens that makes it all of a sudden you're unable to not notice it, I was talking to a friend of mine from New Orleans, and he said that about their infamous statue to the Battle of Liberty place. And he said that, I mean, he was like, it's not like I was walking around just feeling oppressed by this thing, but then circumstances changed, things happened in society that all of a sudden it became quite noticeable. So I think that's in a way how it works, and that kind of ebbs and flows over time depending on what's happening in our world and our society, et cetera. I mean, sorry. Oh, I thought someone said something. I started to think seriously about these. For me, that kind of thing happened with Dylan Roof, which I didn't realize until I was preparing this today, that is the literal 5-year anniversary of the Charleston Mother Emanuel shooting, 5 years ago to the day. I remember just where I was when I saw it happen, or saw the news story of it happen. As we all know, 9 worshipers murdered after he prayed with them. And explicitly in his manifesto, he says this is based on white grievance, white genocide, fear of losing the white race, all that kind of stuff. And obviously, afterwards debates about removing monuments and flags and Confederate iconography happened very quickly, and it's all very good. And I watched as people, and I started to notice these things more and more. More and more people were noticing street names or some like things you didn't quite notice, school names, etc. And I watched as people called for monuments to come down. I watched as people defended monuments. I watched as some people took the middle way, as some people just habitually do no matter what. And this debate, which was already kicking along steadily, kicked into gear again for me with Charlottesville, probably for everyone else here too. And it kind of really put it at another level a couple of years later, where these folks gathered together to ostensibly defend the Robert E. Lee statue from being taken down because of the events that happened at Mother Emanuel Church. And when I watched all that stuff happening, that almost in real time, and my professor at Elon was there, involved in this sort of counter-protesting. So I was very keenly aware of what was happening there. It just seemed like something was revealed for me. Something broke there for me about what was going on with these things, what was being conjured there. And so in the wake of these events, I just really wanted to understand the energy that these monuments were attracting throughout history and today, and to undermine them, frankly. I mean, I'm not going to pretend like I'm some sort of neutral person here, right? I'm not a historian, I'm a theologian and an ethicist. I mean, I'm attentive to history. You know, I want to be rooted in history, but I don't do history. Other people have done the history quite well. So I wanted to undermine them. But I didn't just want to pull down the statues. I don't shed any tears when that happens, really, but I wanted to disrupt what got them there in the first place. And what I came to discover is that Confederate monuments attract energy, at least in part because there's theology behind much of what gave and gives them their meaning. Some of that theology is implicit, which I will talk about in a bit, and powerful for being implicit, and some of it's quite explicit, just written right on there, or was talked about at the dedication ceremonies. And so they're kind of like, they came to feel like to me material objects that reinforce this theological vision of reality. And so a counter theology I wanted to find that could push against what they were conjuring. That's kind of where I started to think through these. And that's why it's been 5 years or so about to the day, because it just got me thinking along those lines. So what I wanted to do first is just give us sort of 5 minutes max, sort of very brief historical overview. And the only reason I want to do this is just to make sure, I assume we all kind of know this. So, some of it, you know, you've seen memes and newspaper articles or whatever about the Confederate monuments generally, but I want to kind of just make sure we're kind of generally on the same page. And if you have questions, I'll stop. And if you have any questions about anything, I'll answer. So these are just some simple facts about these Confederate monuments. There are a lot of them. There are over 140 in North Carolina alone. Now, of course, that number is changing a bit, right, given what goes on, but generally speaking, around 140, and with the ones erected into the 21st century, which is not often talked about. Durham, Burnsville, Gaston County, Dobson, one to Johnston and General Johnston. All right, that was erected in 2010. So I don't know if anybody today is actively mourning the dead for the Civil War, but something tells me no. So something else is going on with those constructions. They were contested. At the moment, they were contested. They weren't uncontroversial. Committees ended up debating these things, including their design, their placement, even where the stones were taken from, where the granite was taken from to construct them. If the granite was taken from the north, that was no good. Like every aspect of these were constructed with their subtle meaning in mind. So these weren't just slapdash put together, if that makes any sense. At the time, they were never, another way to say this is they were never talked about as mere historical markers just to mark history, right? They were erected, and those erecting them said this, to narrate the past in a very specific way to win the war of ideas, in order to articulate a vision of the future that would be manifest in their present and future presence like us. These ideals included, they would say, white supremacy, the superiority of white people over others, particularly black people, ideal manhood and womanhood, devotion to a glorious past that would, quote, and one ex-general said, forge the holiest bond of unity in the present between white folks, both North and South alike. And so in that sort of general move, there are kind of 3 waves of construction. The way to think about them as a broad overstroke is there's 3 waves of construction. The middle period is when most are constructed, but there's 3 general bumps. The first wave tended to, right after the Civil War, generally, tended to be put in cemeteries and other so-called death spaces is how people talk about it. And their designs tended to be bare obelisks. So like the Washington Monument, just sort of a stone thing up. Sometimes people's names written on the side. So they tended to be placed, Gaines Foster has a wonderful book called Ghosts of the Confederacy. And he marks this all out. 90% of monuments erected between 1865 and 1885 have 90% of them have some funereal aspects in placement and or design and 70% are placed directly in cemeteries. So like Oakwood cemeteries in Raleigh, there's one there, 1870, just a bare obelisk, there it sits. These monuments at this time, this first wave, are focal points for rituals of remembrance and marches, including so-called decoration days or memorial days, where people would come to decorate the graves of the dead, including lots of unmarked graves, because lots of people died somewhere else and you didn't, their body never came back. Now I would note here, obviously that's going to be different from what comes later. And just because they were put up early doesn't make them innocent. I don't want to say that either. Already talk of states' rights would be used to talk about some of them on some of the monuments. And for example, Edward Pollard, who wrote in 1868, The Lost Cause Regained, which popularized this historical narrative called Lost Cause, I'm sure you've all heard about it, said what they were doing was, quote, to the extent of securing the supremacy of the white man and the traditional liberties of the country, the South really triumphs in the true cause of the war with respect to all its fundamental and vital issues. So the movement became, even in its early days, it was like a combination of grief, but also anxiety to recover honor that was perceived to have been lost by losing the war. Also during this first wave is not free from what would become more prominent later, mob violence, Southern resistance to perceived Republican oppression. You have to sort of remember to flip the sort of political map pre-1965-70. So big R Republicans are the party of Lincoln and all that, and the big D Democrats are the ones who were, Southern Dixiecrats kind of. Mob violence was used and utilized even early on to resist perceived Republican oppression, or as the Democratic VP Frank Blair put it, resist rule by a, quote, semi-barbarous race of blacks. And so 10%, for instance, of black members of the Constitutional Convention were victims of lynchings or mob violence in 1867 and 1868. And over 400 lynchings happened between 1868 and 71 alone. So that's the first wave. So we got that one down, mostly in cemeteries, mostly to do with the dead, but also not, pure markers by any stretch of the imagination. You know what I'm saying? It is more complicated. The second wave is when the vast majority are erected, with a slow growth towards the beginning of the 20th century, and peaking in the 19-teens and 20s. So 40 to 60 years later. Most are not constructed at the end after the war, right after the war ends, to mourn the dead. As theologian James Cone writes, at this moment in history, the United States is struggling to define itself as a white nation, and this includes both black people, but also a sort of fear of immigration as well, that the second wave of the Klan is attentive to, fear of Catholics, fear of immigrants, fear of black folks, fear of Jews, all those sorts of things. And to define black people as childlike and therefore incapable of political and social equality. And so white people reclaim power, particularly from populist and Republican movements, through the imposition of Jim Crow, lynching in the sense that the high period of lynching, and the absolute majority of Confederate statues are constructed then. And then through the 1890s, the monuments are constructed during this time, and they're not placed in cemeteries or battlefields, and they no longer have this sort of funereal aspect. Rather, they move from grief to kind of celebration. The monuments become of generals, or the most common one would be the common soldier statue, which is just a single white man at parade rest. 192 are put up in towns between 1900 and 1912, which is a lot. In places of government property, political power, legislative buildings, courthouses, etc. I'd also note here that as far as the North was concerned, many just wanted to end, quote, sectional animus. And so Confederate monuments were also constructed as easy calls for reconciliation and reunion between North and South. And so the North also kind of liked these things. They were symbols of like unity. Frederick Douglass said unity to the exclusion of justice or black people's concerns, but unity between white people. And that's so they're not, that's why there's some in the North. That's why they're like on Gettysburg battlefield and stuff. They're sort of a sign of reunion during this time period. David Blight has a good book on that, if you're interested, called Race and Reunion. It's really good. So the Confederate monuments during this time say the same things as earlier monuments sometimes, but they do something different by way of their contextualization and the context they're put up. The third wave, very quickly, is during the Civil Rights era. And I don't think it takes a Rhodes Scholar to notice that it is right after the Civil War, and then the birth of Jim Crow and lynching, and then the Civil Rights era when the peaks of these monuments are constructed. That could be just a crazy coincidence, but let me put it this way: the people at the time constructing them did not say this was coincidental. So if it's coincidence, it's coincidence they didn't even know about. If that makes any sense. You're giving them, I don't know, they are saying, they tell on themselves. All you have to do is read what they say. They're not telling on themselves. It's not something to be embarrassed of. They genuinely think the white race is superior to everything else. So there's nothing to hide, they just say it. That's what it is. So yeah, 3 waves: grief, recovery, lost honor, then sort of a growth into more public places with more sort of signaling more than just simply grief and mourning. Let me pause here. Questions, clarifications? What'd you say? Say that part again. Anything, What about this? I don't know.
Ryan, what was the number? Because I've been fascinated to see how many of these monuments are outside of the southeastern United States. Get any numbers on what it is nationwide?
I don't have that exact number. More than you would think. So more than you think, and the reason would be what I said, particularly like ones that like in Baltimore. I mean, Baltimore is the South technically, but
I thought I read about one in like Maine or Vermont the other day.
Yeah, and there could be a variety of reasons for that. People could immigrate and then like want one there. That's why there's like ones in there's one in Arizona that was put up in the 20th century. I don't know if you know anything about the United States history, but Arizona was not involved in the Civil War. I don't think it existed. So that's a weird one. But that's the reason. Yeah.
Thanks. Oh, hang on, Betty. I'll unmute you.
Unmute. Am I unmuted now?
You're good.
I read something today. It said the North won the war, but the South won the peace. And these monuments represent their narrative. The narrative basically being propaganda about what happened.
Yes. That's really well said. Yeah, that's what that guy said. So that propaganda is the lost cause mythology. Right. A really good book right now just came out. It's called The False Cause, that goes into fraud, fabrication, white supremacy, and Confederate memory. And it talks all about, I wish it had been out when I was writing this thing. It talks about that exactly. And so they say, we lost the war. Slavery was ended. And God, they were deeply, I'll talk about this in a second, they're deeply theological in their way they framed this, North and South alike at the time. So this was providential somehow. But the providence was that God got rid of slavery, but not that God got rid of white supremacy. That we are still superior as, and in fact, the sort of anxiety would grow because you could imagine, well, how are we going to reinforce this thing? It's pretty obvious if you're just owning people. And so they would say, exactly as you said, we will not lose this war of ideas. And they did win the war of ideas. They did. The way people in our history classes, probably yours, talked about the Reconstruction era, that it was not talked about very accurately, I can tell you. It was talked about in this terms of like bad rule, northern emphasis, overreach and all this kind of stuff. That's all from this sort of propaganda effort. It's just accurate. South didn't fight for slavery, but states' rights. We only lost because of superior numbers, but we were much more militarily prowess. Lee and Jackson were going to get rid of their slaves anyway, and most Southerners were against slavery anyway. I think those are the big ones. Those are the big ones. Most of that's just complete nonsense. Some of it's just overemphasis or underemphasis. Lee is the military prowess is right. I mean, obviously they were good on the battlefield. Yeah. So yeah, that's absolutely well said. I don't know where you read that, but that's right on.
Somewhere on my iPad, I have no remembrance of where it was either.
On this square rectangle thing.
Yeah, right.
Ryan, I have another question, but I'll ask it at the end because I don't want to slow you down.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'll keep going then. So there's a lot I could talk about from there. So I'm just going to be brief, right? But what is the theology then? My question became, I guess I'm talking about now, is what is the theology in monuments? And how can they be understood and disrupted at this level? Not just as historical objects. So I want to talk about those in terms of explicit and implicit theological convictions. Some of those are explicit, some are like baked in to the way they're designed. So to start, I think we should just note that theology is all over Confederate monuments, and if you look for it, you will see it. Indeed, the Civil War was considered a kind of theological referendum, and theology continued to mark debates about its legacy in the war years afterwards. I mean, it was like whose God was right, very seriously. Mark, that's what this book Mark Knoll writes, called Civil War as a Theological Crisis, makes this case quite well using primary sources. And so Christian theology, obviously, when it came to remembering the Civil War, also came to play in understanding what was going on. This was there on the monuments. It was also there in these dedication ceremonies. You didn't just put up a monument. You would have a dedication ceremony. And I mean, in some cases, at the Robert E. Lee one in Richmond in 1890, it was 100 to 150,000 people, which is nuts, especially for that, like that's impressive. And so, for example, the Stonewall Jackson monument in 1875, not the horse one, but the other one on the state capitol. Stonewall gets 2 monuments in Richmond. And if you know anything about the Civil War history, it's Stonewall and Robert E. Lee. I mean, that's just like, Jesus and the Father or whatever. Like that's just in Travelers of the Spirit. I don't know. I should add, my dad is half Canadian, so I wasn't raised like revering the Lost Cause or any of this stuff. So I, going to school in North Carolina, I was from North Carolina, but very much as a sort of like, wait, what are y'all talking about? Like, the South rise again. So like, I was very much from the outside on those sorts of conversations as a weird Canadian. Not really, but to them, I was a weird Canadian. At Jackson's monument dedication ceremony, he was held up as the perfection, I'm not joking, not exaggerating, the perfection of Christian piety by preachers and speakers. People wept, prayers were offered, hymns were sung, including A Mighty Fortress is Our God. A grand arch was constructed over the monument, which featured an angel of peace, a Bible, a cross, and the words warrior Christian patriot. So no points for subtlety. A prayer was offered by the ex-chaplain of the CSA, who prayed, "Grant, Lord, that the monument erected on this spot to the honor of thy servant may ever stand as a permanent memorial to thy praise and a perpetual incentive to a high and holy consecration to thy service and all the avocations of life. May it silently and effectually inculcate noble ideas and inspire lofty sentiments in all spectators for all time to come. Above all, may it teach the youth of the land," always the youth, "the solemn lesson of thy word, that the foundation of true greatness is fidelity to thee." So note the conflation there of fidelity to God, to the Bible, and this monument, all kind of collapsed into one. And thus to take down the monument was going to start to feel like, a sacrilege, heresy, something bad. This is very representative of the way these dedications would go. It would also be written on the monuments themselves. Our cause is with God and hope of a joyful resurrection. In one memorial fountain in Arkansas, it was said that the water in it symbolized the loving stream of blood shed by the Southern soldiers, and drinkers from the fount were thus symbolically baptized in Confederate blood. Again, no points for subtlety. The CSA slogan itself, does anyone know what it is? Deo Vindus, which is, I don't know how to pronounce that in Latin, but under God our vindicator, or God will defend us. And they explicitly said, written into the Confederate Constitution, that this was the Christian God, not that deists, heterodox one up from, our previous, husk from which we have sprung. So it's all very explicit. Theology is right there on them. And so 2 theological themes you're always going to see, I think. There's others that I talk about, but 2 big ones. The first one I want to note is sacrifice, obviously. Sacrifice in the nature of remembrance. And that's going to be the most prominent, it would seem to me. I've looked at a lot of these things. Confederate monuments regularly mention, so first, sacrifice. They regularly mention the importance of remembering our Confederate dead and their sacrifice. You, the viewer, are called to remember them laying down their lives. And a good example of this, I think, is the one in Wilmington, North Carolina, that was put up in 1924. So a good, 26 years after the massacre coup, and the only successful coup in United States history. After that, good 20 years later, you got a monument. So this is a common soldier statue. He is striding north. Let me see here. Oh, never mind, I can't do it. Never mind. He's striding north, of course, he's facing north, and he represents the virtue of courage. He has a Bible on his waist. He's stepping over a dead soldier who represents the virtue of sacrifice. And on the monument writes, is right on the middle of the thoroughfare, Confederates, blend your recollections, let memory weave its bright reflections, let love revive life's ashen embers, for love is life since love remembers, followed by pro aris et facis, which is a very common colloquial phrase that gets translated often for God and country. But the literal translation of that is for our altars and hearths. And I find that to be quite interesting. Its traditional use is to signal attachment to what is most dear, most worthy of sacrifice, but the origins of the phrase aren't irrelevant. In Roman antiquity, the altars signaled by that phrase referred to these little altars that were had guardian deities called lares that would be in your home. They'd have little things around your home or on your city or in your neighborhood or whatever. And the idea was that on these things sat these little gods that you would give sacrifices to, and they would provide you spiritual and quite material protection from outsiders, from negativity, etc. And so a kind of theology of sacrifice is evoked, tied together with remembrance, tied together with, if it's the death and the blood of these Confederate soldiers, in some cases you literally drink of it and partake in their salvific blood or something, in order to suggest that they died to provide a kind of protection of the South, of white people in the South. I mean, when they say, for our Confederate dead, I mean, the our there seems pretty clear who they're talking about, who they're not talking about. Not scalawags and not, black people. These themes are so prominent that they came to be said to cultivate what's called the cult of sacrifice in the South during this time period. Sacrifice becomes super prevalent in monuments in general at this time, and also in the South. So in the North, for instance, Horace Bushnell, who was a Congregationalist minister, said that the blood sacrifice of the Union soldiers cemented a national unity forever sanctified. Oliver Wendell Holmes, who later became, I think he was a Supreme Court justice eventually, but I don't think he was at the time he said this. He said that sacrifice itself was inherently virtuous, and it doesn't really matter what you die for. If you die for something that's bigger than yourself, that's what is good. That's what saves you. And he said, I don't really believe in much of anything else, but I believe in that. The trick in the South was, you're talking about the sacrifices or the deaths of people who died for a losing cause. And so you had to find a way to convert these deaths to a losing cause that was sometimes impossibly hard to bear psychologically to a victory in some way. And that's what these monuments serve to do. So similar to that, so remembering sacrifices, there's this invocation of sacrifice, and there's also this invocation of remembrance. There's a kind of remembering that goes on with these monuments that they act like they're neutral. I mean, this is sometimes monuments build into themselves the recognition that they're narrating something, and sometimes, of various sorts, not just Confederate monuments, and sometimes monuments perform as if they're just sort of like they dropped from the sky, from God's mouth to the ground, and they're just telling you what happened historically. And Confederate monuments tend to operate that way. there's not a sort of postmodern sort of sense of this is a particular narration coming from particular people in time. There's none of that with Confederate monuments. This is just what happened. And so they present themselves as dealing just with history. Now, the problem with Confederate monuments, it seems to me, relating to remembrance and sacrifice, is not that they narrate the past. I think all history is narration, truly. The problem is the quality of this narration, the content, what they leave out. The problem is the content and quality. What I think is needed is not neutral memorialization, which I don't know what that even would look like or mean, but a way of filling out and providing kind of counter narrations that would allow us today to tell a truer story about who we are and where we've been. This can include sort of taking down monuments that if they're particularly egregious. I think this can also include messing with monuments in a variety of ways. I think that's not off the table. I certainly am suspicious of calls that say, this was more popular a few years ago at protests and stuff. Some people would say, this is not us. I don't know if y'all heard that. This is not us. This is not the United States. Now, I'd always be like, well, it kind of is. I mean, it's not good. I'm not happy with it, but it's not us. It kind of is the United States. So there's a sort of sense in which finding ways to screw with that narrative without celebrating it becomes the task, in my mind anyway. So theologically for Christians, I think that it should sound plausible that histories are narrated, and we have to find ways to better narrate.
Oops.
Froze up.
I'm speaking poorly here, but theologically, when I think of history, I don't think of history existing on its own or neutrally. I think of it existing in relationship to God, the God of all time. And so the theological assessment of the quality or non-quality of any monument should be at least partly informed by the Christian conviction that God remembers every past in order to judge and redeem what's happened, including past we don't memorialize. But deceptively simply, Christians have a stake in avoiding theories about the past that reinforce a way of remembering as if God doesn't exist. To remember well means to remember in and through the memory of Christ, the criteria by which we judge faithful and unfaithful remembrance. Further, Christians should be bothered by and seek to counter the essentially idolatrous vision of sacrifice evoked by Confederate monuments. Sacrifice of the sort recounted by these monuments seems to be zero-sum. You give of yourself and you lose yourself for greater good. You empty yourself for a wider thing. The Christian claim is that we should, at least certain strands of it, is that we should participate in Christ's death, who is the end of sacrifice, the end of victimization itself. And Hebrews talks about this quite clearly. Christ died once and for all, as the saying goes, and therefore no more sacrifice is demanded. God is not Moloch, requiring constant sacrifices to some God, but this God of, I don't know what, CSA or something, seems to demand that sort of perpetual remembrance of sacrifices given. So together, one strategy for disruption I explore in the book is employing Christian theology to complicate the memories that these monuments conjure, remembering the narratives they tell or leave untold through the dangerous memory of Christ, whose unique sacrifice Christians confess is the key to viewing history aright. One path for doing this I explore in the book is through, okay, so what is going on at this time period that is left out of the remembrances? There's a lot of things happening during that second wave in particular of Confederate monuments that are happening. And a huge thing that are happening is lynchings. And so I don't know if y'all are familiar with the Equal Justice Initiative work that has gone on with this work of kind of trying to get the guy who wrote Just Mercy, and there's a movie now about him, helped get this thing, Equal Justice Initiative, going, including a lynching museum down in Montgomery, Alabama, which was not well received by everybody who lived down there, by the way. And so it seemed to me, when I'm thinking about what I'm talking about as far as bringing to bear Christ in our way of remembering well, I don't mean like we should put a cross in front of it. First of all, that'd be pointlessly and not like simple. Second of all, there's already crosses all over the place. That's really stupid. That's not what I'm talking about. I have more in mind something like what would it look like to like put a lynching marker in and around one of these Confederate monuments? Frankly, that's where they would probably go. What that would do to change the way the uptake of this monument felt to people as they observed this this monument. That where was I? That would help us see, it seems to me, at least white folks anyway, that the goal here is not a quick kind of fix, that attending to these symbols of colonialism or racism is one done, but it's not the end of the work that needs to be done in itself. That's one kind of strategy towards it. The person's work I have in mind in particular is this guy, James Cone, who writes a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And he connects God's self-identification with people who are suffering, and in particular people who are lynched, with God's death on the cross. He writes himself here, because God identifies fully and actually with those who are marginalized, to really understand Jesus' sacrifice for today, one must understand that his crucifixion was the result, Jesus' crucifixion was the result of forces far closer to American lynch mobs than many white people would care to admit. Even more profoundly, if God was present at every lynching and claimed their suffering as God's own, then the lynching tree is the cross in the United States. American Christians discover the real scandal of the cross when they realize that Jesus is met in and among the crucified bodies that are obscured and ignored every day, and in history, I would say too. So part of what I want to do then is sort of say, to create, rather than this remembrance that talks about this one kind of sacrifice, finding ways to hook into this other counter theology of a very different way of talking about sacrifice in Christ that would do something to change the uptake of these monuments. I don't think that's some sort of panacea or cure-all or something, but it's one sort of way of taking the theology that's already there and kind of flipping it on its head, is a way of thinking about what I'm talking about there. I can go to the next one, or I can stop and pause for questions if you're like, I don't know what half of that was. What do you think, Bob?
Yeah, we're coming up at about 10 till 8, so you want to take a few questions? Because I want to make sure we get a chance for everybody to ask what they wanted, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's anything. I'm good. Yeah.
Sure. Everybody okay, or we can keep going?
I like that sort of a keto thing that you're suggesting. Exactly. It's I'm not smart enough to figure those out, but I like it when I see it.
I love that you just used that analogy. I love that. Yeah, keto. Yeah. That's exactly that's the actual idea. And I say I say the beginning and at the end and all throughout. I'm not sitting here trying to say what needs to be done or whatever. I don't think a book is appropriate for that, certainly not written by me. It's more like exploring different sorts of avenues for disruption that are possible. And I think that's one that could be interesting to be done, particularly in places and towns where if removal is not going to be an option in the next foreseeable future.
Yeah.
Ryan, I'm curious, you were talking about sort of the history you've learned and that sort of thing. And I know when we talked about Old Testament history, we often talked about sort of the Zionist strand, and you had to kind of separate and say, to understand Zionist theology, you have to step outside of yourself and say, here, this is the mindset that people are understanding. And so you try to read that in an objective way and then step outside. And I feel like particularly with the history of the South, at least the history courses that I took, was always, as you get into that monument period you're talking about, I particularly remember taking a South Carolina history class and the professor saying, okay, you have to take one part of Ben Tillman and put him here and the other part and put him here and say, here was somebody who made remarkable strides for white South Carolinians over a 30-year strand, and at the same time did immeasurable damage to blacks and other non-citizens or other or marginalized folks in those communities. And we just sort of, I feel like for so long that was just the strategy, was to say, okay, we're just looking at this theology. We're trying to pull the positive out and only look at that, and then we're pushing that aside. So how do we, in that disruption, does the disruption offer any ability to reclaim? Is there anything good to reclaim out of these, I guess is the way or is that even a terrible thing to ask?
No, definitely not. I don't really think there is any terrible things to ask. There's terrible things to say. Questions are a different matter. So I hear what you're saying. I kind of think the funny thing about, I mean, there's a lot to more say. Don't have time to get into about the very nature of what monuments are and how they function. But that's part of what's going on, right? Is the nature of monuments is not just a simple matter of, learning lessons about history and nuances and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's by definition people who either were in power and had resources or had access to people who were in power and resources, narrating kind of what they want. It's typically an idealized version. In fact, there's a reason most of the general statues didn't get put up, Susan, until after they were all dead, is because they said a dead Lee is much more useful to us than a living Lee, because they could then mold him into their image they wanted him to be in. By emphasis, not like, the oh yeah.
Well, like I was really interested to hear the Joseph Daniels statue got taken down this week, and his grandson said he did so many great things for North Carolina, but the great stuff he did cannot lessen his involvement in the Wilmington race riots and other things, and for that reason we're not keeping his statue across. We're taking the statue away, and that to me was just such a poignant statement that was one of those. It's sort of the opposite of sort of the history that we've been sort of taught. At least my generation was taught that, like, okay, like, yes, they're compromised, but just sort of push the compromised part aside and focus on the good. Whereas this seems to be sort of the opposite reaction.
I mean, it's the kind of thing where, I think that kind of nuanced work still should happen in history classes and in textbooks and conversations. That's all still possible to do. The question of memorialization or monument and putting in a monument is you're doing something different with that person, right? And you're holding, like, what was the reason they were held up, right? It probably wasn't because he was nice to his kids or something like that. It's also important to note, I think, it's always each generation's job to maintain whatever monuments or memorializations or histories we want. That's non-negotiable. Somebody's got to cut the grass on these things. Somebody's got to clean the grime off these things. And if we don't want to do it, it's our job to do that. And so that's the second thing. It's always up to each generation to re-inherit or not inherit what has been given to us. That's just we can't pass that off. We can't pass that discernment process off as like, well, this is in the past. Like, that's not how it works. The third thing is, I think everybody's got feet of clay. I think that is true in the sense that, it's always going to be kind of good and bad mixed together. The question is going to be, what thing is the driving force of this person's narrative? It's not really about the person actually anyway. It's about the idea that they're representing for us in public, and if that thing is predominantly this thing, or if the biggest thing is this, the Wilmington race riots and being a raging white supremacist, then that's just sort of like, that's different from whatever other things that might put something like a category. So I'm sensitive to that, actually, but I think I still think sometimes that's just how it's got to go. Certainly, if I kind of mentioned this in that article, that essay I wrote, if you pass laws where a town or a state or a local town can't get rid of a monument they want to get rid of, Birmingham, Alabama comes to mind immediately, but as does like Silent Sam. What do you expect to happen? Nobody wants the thing, or most people don't want the thing. You got people from Alamance driving over to say they want it, but I mean, they're not the ones who walk past the thing telling them whatever the joke is every day. This is kind of what's going to happen. So it's like if you pass laws like that, then communities are going to react the way they're going to react if they don't want it. It's stone after all. I mean, it's not magic. I don't know.
So I have a question, being that I'm going to approach this from kind of a legal perspective.
Lord.
And well, you said in the beginning that every monument was kind of constructed with a purpose in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that they went into committee and all that. So does the North Carolina Archives have that anywhere where where someone like me who's like a legal researcher could go and find and figure out what the reasoning of the legislature was in erecting such monuments?
Yes. Now, if it's like what often would happen would be because women were considered to be more good with sentimental matters. The United Daughters of the Confederacy, or them would be in charge of doing this. And so there was probably a lot of closed door meetings about precisely the aesthetic design, except for what they wanted to publicize. But as far as the stuff that was public, like in legislative meetings and stuff, yeah, that's absolutely available. And that's where some of that, those speeches come from people who talk about it. So sort of like half and half is what I would guess. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Everybody muted. It's funny how when you read those things, I've read some of them, but again, I mostly approach as a theologian, right, or ethicist. And so I let other historians and people who do that work kind of do it for me, right? But I've read some of them, and again, they're not really, when they talk about this stuff, they don't hide what they're talking about or what they're doing, the design, what it's meant to do. You don't see this sort of, well, we're going to put this up because we want to preserve history, not erase history, or some sort of like the kind of ad hoc move that people make to defend them as neutral. You don't see that from them. This is very much like this is put up as a sort of celebration of these different ideals, and always mentioned. I mean, pretty much always mentioned as lost cause narratives, and for instance, the Julian Carr speech he gives during Silent Sam. Everyone knows a lot of people know the thing he says about he horsewhipped a black girl. And he brags about that, which is obviously heinous. At the same speech that doesn't get as much play for some reason, he says that the monument itself stands for the welfare of the Anglo-Saxon race, and that the virtues of the men, the virtues of sacrifice and courage of the common soldier he says, quote, saved the very life of the Anglo-Saxon race in the South. And as a consequence, the purest strain of the Anglo-Saxon is to be found in the 13 southern states, praise God. So, it's like the theology is there, the white supremacy is there, and he's just sort of like, he's just saying it, right? There's no kind of, this is designed to reinforce this, like that's what it is. What he said about the other thing's bad, but that seems to be right at the heart of what that monument was always meant to do, for instance, that particular one. Yeah, so that'd be interesting to really dig into those, but I'm sure there's 2 new books that are just written on Confederate monuments, one published by UNC Press, that does some of that work. One just published, who argues like that the birth of military virtues in the United States, sort of what we think of as military virtues, were almost birthed at this time by the construction of Confederate monuments during this period. So, that's the other thing to say. There's a lot of stuff going on with these monuments. They perform at different levels. Early ones, I think, have genuine grief and lament wrapped into them. In certain cases, like I don't think those need to be disrupted in any way, similar to Robert E. Lee in Richmond or something. So like it's always kind of complicated. I would beware of people who would just say Confederate monuments as a whole mean this, because it's too broad of a brush to talk about the various times and places and locations that they were constructed. That doesn't change the fact that most of them are bad. But anyway.
Hey, Ryan, this is Tim Moore. We had our video off because we're cooking dinner at the same time. We're trying to watch all this. So you talked a little bit about the way atonement theology and Christ's sacrifice kind of affected all these monuments and the theology that created all that. But I'm also wondering, in what way do you think the Protestant emphasis on salvation by grace also affected kind of white supremacy, in that you weren't saved by what you do, so you could treat slaves and Black Americans in terrible ways, and you could still be saved by Jesus because you just believed. So in what way do you think that this kind of Protestant grace theology really enabled white supremacy to run rampant in the South?
Big time. That's a really good point. The first thing I'll say is slightly related, but it's not as, I'll get right to your point in a second, but it just made me think of it. What's weird, partly weird, is there's a typical Protestant aversion, certainly Baptists would know this, to like outward signs and like physical objects, like aiding devotion or ritual. I mean, even if that's fake most of the time, we like to think of ourselves as that. I mean, I'm Baptist, we don't do those Catholic things or whatever. But these Confederate monuments were like this weird exception in the South, where everyone was really into like relics and objects and other sorts of things that like kind of went against certain things that you would expect them to do as a sort of Protestant devotionality. Does that make any sense? Like, yeah, you would tend to think it's like about the word heard and what you feel in your heart, the love you have in your heart. And what happens with an object is like kind of inconsequential, but that is absolutely not how they function in Southern Christian piety. And it's treated as like these monuments that have all this weight to them. To the question of theology of grace over the Bible, that's hugely, there's folks who've done work on that that just show that that's the case. I don't know if I wouldn't say just Protestant, but I mean, I don't know all that, but certainly like a Christian division between the soul and the body, a hard division between the soul and the body, such that never the twain shall meet, a hard division between faith and action, faith and works, reinforces a sense in which, okay, what I do, I mean, what Paul says to whatever, what I do physically is one thing over here, but, I know I have Jesus in my heart. And so there's a sort of get out of jail free card, get out of hell free card, I don't know, that gets you off the hook. And get your, frankly, your grandma, your granddad off the hook too. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I think that's absolutely a part of it. It's a little bit harder thing theologically to not divorce those things and then have to look back at things that people who are your people have done and say, oh, I can't just say, well, grace, I talk about in the book, Dietrich Bonhoeffer talks about the difference between cheap and costly grace. And I think what you're talking about was there was the creation of, or the reinforcement of what Bonhoeffer calls cheap grace, which is grace without, he says grace without a cross, but what he means is grace without any call to discipleship, any call to action, grace that would exempt you from having to do anything, actually. And certainly in cases of great societal injustice, that is a real, it either justifies what you are doing or justifies your inaction in the face of what's going on around you. I mean, it's truly like an opiate. I don't think Christianity always functions like that because I know prophetic strains of Christianity, but some of it does, and that's what Bonhoeffer's getting at. And if you know anything about Bonhoeffer, he lived that out. He lived out pushing against that kind of grace. So grace is still there, but I think you're absolutely right that a kind of cheap grace allows these sorts of theologies and ideologies to kind of go.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Brian. Thanks.
There's actually a story where it's probably apocryphal, but I don't know. It's Robert E. Lee, and he's towards the end of his life, and he's on the campus of, I guess it'd be Washington College, and Washington Lee, right? And he there's some Confederate soldiers debating, and they are saying if a Confederate soldier died, he went automatically to heaven. And they're having this debate back and forth, and they mostly are kind of on the side of this. which is cheap grace times a million. I mean, that's straight up crusade stuff. And they ask Lee what he thinks about it, and he says, as the story goes, that might be good Confederacy, but it's not good theology. So that's what I mean by a dead Lee is more useful than a living Lee, because he might not truck with this stuff, maybe. He kind of did, but you know what I mean? He might not show the line. So that cheap grace, that's like cheap grace gone wild. It's just like, if you die for the Confederacy, you're good to go. Which I don't know what Jesus has anything to do with any of that, you know, whatever.
So what about the idea that, I'm Tilly Duncan. The idea that, so the class system in England and the good part of Europe that we come from, when some people are appointed by God to be rulers and some people are appointed to be the servants. And so how do we, I mean, it's sort of inbred into white people that we're the lords, we're the underlords, and that these people have been ordained by God to stay in their place.
That was the second theological theme I didn't get to talk about. You were absolutely right. That is reinforced by these monuments. It's the theological vision of what J. Cameron Carter has this ginormous theological book called Race, a Theological Account. It's like this big. And he talks about that. And he talks about how that logic was birthed from kind of Christian sources, misused, I would argue, but nonetheless, deep, you know, they were genuinely Christian people. And it's, you know, he calls it either the master-slave logic or the Lord-servant logic or whatever. And those are reinforced by certain habits of interpreting Christian theology. And the monuments themselves also reinforce this vision of the Herrenvolk kind of theology, which is like there's a sort of hierarchy of the races, and white, which is a complete construct, but whiteness is at the top, blackness is at the bottom, and you can kind of have gradations of this depending on how nuanced you want to be. That's a humongous thing going on in the 19th century as well, with phrenology and pseudoscience and all the rest. Unfortunately, kind of having a comeback right now. Not with skulls, but with genes. And so that is a huge part of it. You're absolutely right. And so that is reinforced by these in their design. Not so much explicitly, although every once in a while it would show up explicitly at dedication ceremonies, or like the New Orleans Battle of Liberty Place down in New Orleans was infamous because it said on there, this was a monument for white supremacy, which was like a little too close for comfort. You know, you're supposed to like say the loud part quiet. But in design, they always reinforce this, and they were so anxious of how they presented the white body, the white male body in particular, as representing sort of being in control, being on a horse, which showed your sort of mastery over nature and stuff. And if you were a woman, if you were portrayed, you would be sitting most of the time to show your sort of like passivity and subservience. And if you were a black person, if you were lucky to be portrayed at all, and you probably wouldn't be lucky to be portrayed, it would be in an extremely kind of subservient, crouching kind of position. So I don't know if I'm getting to what you're saying, but to say that is absolutely present in these as well. And those have deep theological kind of reservoirs of meat that's drawing on a deeper theology than just the 19th century. And that is the main reason why I think removal of Confederate monuments, especially from public places, that's the main reason why that needs to happen for the most part. That's kind of the gold standard response, it seems to me, for that exact kind of reason. Other sorts of responses can be helpful and creative and aikido, but like the main one should probably be like that Robert E. Lee statues. I don't know who said it. Was it you, Susan, who talked about like you see it and it's just like overwhelming in this way? I mean, that's by design. Like they want you to feel that way. You know, it's not some accident that feels that way. You're supposed to feel just awed. And it's supposed to be beautiful, but beautiful, you know, in a particular sense of what is beauty. I don't think everybody at Richmond thought of as beautiful. Obviously, that's happening right now as it's been redecorated. Everyone's coming out to almost celebrate its marking up or whatever. So I'm sorry, Tilly, did I get it what you're saying, or?
Yes, I just think that it's really difficult for many white people to give up the idea that, yeah, God put us here and this is what we should be doing. I just think it's really difficult. Yes.
One man I cite in the book, I wanted to go look at, I'll just paraphrase it. He says, I mean, not to quote Jesus or anything, but, it's going to be a matter of dying to yourself, insofar as you've been, and some folks, it's just not going to happen. I mean, I hate to say that, but I don't know. Maybe I'm not supposed to think that as a Christian or whatever, but I don't know. It seems some folks too tied up in it or something, other than by like a miracle, But it's gonna be a kind of dying to a way you thought stuff was. I mean, that's the bottom line. Yeah, it's gonna be painful for some folks. For some folks, it's not. Some folks, it's like I've seen with students too. I mean, I teach at Campbell. There's plenty of folks, kids coming from East North Carolina or whatever. For some folks, it's just like, oh, good. It's almost a relief. You see kind of a breathing of relief. But for other folks, it's tied up. And you'd be surprised, maybe I don't need to speak for you, but I've been surprised. It's not necessarily who you might think it would be either. It doesn't map easily on, it's this kind of person or this kind of whatever. Very, whatever. Very moderate, liberal, Raleigh folks can be very, very, all of a sudden, you don't even know that's there, and then it gets scratched and it pops up. So yeah, you're right to point that out.
Well, and sure, it is difficult to think about dying to ourselves, because number one, I'm not sure the church has really taught what dying to yourself is, because they've linked that to certain things like you don't drink or you don't play cards or you don't, Yeah. They've made it material rather than spiritual.
Yeah, hyper individual. And that's the other thing that's funny. So folks in the South looked at why we lost the war. It must have been God punishing us for something. But they didn't connect it to any of these structural, systemic things. So it was because of sin. But when they said sin, they didn't mean slavery. They meant drinking, literally, exactly what you just said, moral laxity, by which they meant individual, what my professor at Elon used to call a theology of the waist. Anything that happens below your belly button and above your knees is probably sinful. That's why we were punished. Plus we were drinking, and moral laxity in general. Like that's kind of what they put it on. And so, yeah, it's been so narrowed down, that language, that it's just, I don't know, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't describe anything. I'm not saying everyone needs to go drink and play cards or whatever, although I like doing both of those things, but that's not the point. It's just
I just use that as
yeah. It's just so kind of anemic, you know what I mean? But compared to what these other folks are talking about when they talk about sin and what it means to die to yourself. Because what you get on the other side of dying to yourself in that sense is you get your humanity. James Baldwin would say you get your humanity. You get, like, you find something that you didn't realize was missing. Or Wendell Berry, also a white guy, farmer, poet, talks about, you realize there is a sort of wound for white people. You realize there's sort of wound there that gets healed, that you didn't even, it was like there festering, you didn't even realize it was there. You get sort of a community of people on the other side of that. So it's not just a death, but it is a letting go of something that you thought was real and important.
So Richard Rohr says today something much the same, is that's true freedom, is when you're able to do that, when you're able to get outside of all these other things that you are, empty yourself out and just be open. That's real true freedom, instead of trying to feel that you have to protect your line, protect your image, protect all of that. If you just can release all of that, then it's truly, truly free.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying I think it is a process. You know what I mean? I think it's an ongoing thing. I mean, anybody will tell you that it doesn't do this kind of work. But but it's not. I also don't think it's something that's impossible and you never get anywhere with it. Or yeah, yeah. I mean, it sounds very. Sorry.
You know, I just think that this dialogue is so important, and as we seek to have dialogue and then put it into action concerning Confederate statues, I think we also need to focus on monuments that are, for instance, today I saw a story about money being raised to have a monument outside the Mother Emanuel Church that would commemorate those people that were there, 9 of them that were lost. And I can more so get on board with having those kind of monuments for us to study and to remember than I can about pulling down pulling down the Confederate monuments, which I believe ought to be done. But that to me is a little out of my purview. But I think supporting what is positive and good to remember and to remind us of what's important. Yeah.
I agree. I also think, I mean, one thing I've heard folks say, womanist scholars have said as well, that we don't want a focus on, I mean, the symbols are important. I mean, obviously I would think that, but you don't want that to block or get in the way of, policy laws that are going on right now,
right,
that very much affect folks, including people of color. Like that doesn't, you don't want to lose that in the shuffle as you talk about these street names, although those are important. I'm not right. It should be a sign of a process that's ongoing. And I think the way I hear you talking about it is kind of like, I think different people are going to be, the body is big and there's different roles in it or something. Like there's going to be different folks who are tasked or passionate about different sort of angles, as long as they're coming at the same sort of goal, which would be, in my view, undermining white supremacy. Some folks be more interested in construction. Some folks are going to be more interested in taking stuff down. Some folks be interested in policy. Some folks may be talking about counter remembrance. I don't know, but I think there's different people who are more suited to that, both in terms of gifts and in terms of temperament. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
But the narratives are so important. I mean, I've begun to hear the stories of those people that were lost from their sons and from their daughters and from their cousins, and the kind of lives they live and what they contributed to the community at large. I mean, that narrative is beautiful and wonderful to hear. Sad.
That story, I mean, I know I talked about it at the beginning, but it just, I don't know. It just really
yeah.
It's a gut punch, and I think it should be a wake-up call. I mean, my son was 1.5, and I just remember thinking, this can't be him. I mean, I know it's a weird thing to say,
No.
but it's just like, same with Charlottesville. It's just like, he can't be one of these boys, or men, or whatever. So yeah, I mean, something about that should be remembered in some way. I think that's good stuff.
So it is 8:20. I think we said we would not go past 8:30. So I wonder maybe Ryan, if there's anybody who hasn't asked a question of you yet, if we want to make sure we give the chance to do that, and then maybe give you 5 minutes to say a final. Or maybe an ellipsis, since we all get to read the book in a few weeks when we receive it.
Yeah, sure.
Catherine or Hillary or Hal or Jim or Jean or David, if you all have questions, I think that's who we've not heard from yet. Not to put you on the spot, but I just want to make sure you have a chance if there's a question you want to ask. And if not, we'll go to people who do have questions.
I don't have a question, but I did not realize how much theology was intertwined with the lost cause narrative. So I appreciate the information you've brought to us tonight.
Thank you. Yeah. It was, surprising to me as well.
I have a question for you, Ryan. I wonder, do you see this same kind of theology playing out in any modern monuments?
Oh.
Are we doing the same with office buildings? Are we doing the same with?
Every monument, every physical structure has embedded values in them. I mean, that's sort of talked about in general nowadays. So I guess, material objects of memory in general. So like the office buildings, even if it's just boringest office building you ever have, those are there. These particular narratives, obviously Confederate monuments that are put up still. I mean, if there's a monument to put up to, as y'all probably all know, Nathan Bedford Forrest and outside of Nashville in like, I don't know, 2000 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's newish, and it's got all the same stuff, if not worse. So those are there, yeah. But more often what I think you would expect to see is, and this is part of why it's like, I don't want to just mess with the monuments, not that I don't not want to mess with the monuments, but I want to get at the underlying things. I don't want to just clip the weed and leave the roots untouched, So you'll see, I think you would be looking more for, it would be different. It would be slightly different and changed. It would take different sorts of forms. Does that make sense? It wouldn't be just the exact same, but I think you could find it in other places, certainly in like policies and stuff like that. That would be kind of what I think.
It feels like it might be there with brands, which is more of a name than a monument, but we,
there might be a sense in which they're more superficially aware that you don't want it to look this or that way, because it'll hurt sales in that case. But then that doesn't mean necessarily there might be other sort of pernicious stuff packed into like business practices. It just would have all the right words on the cover of it, which I wouldn't. That would be bad too. So Nike might be real woke. It doesn't mean they don't use slave labor overseas, So
right.
For instance, not to be, I mean.
Or funny that Chick-fil-A uses the cow, right? I mean, if it was a calf in the Old Testament, it would be forbidden, right? So.
Right. Yeah. So the thing that would be that I more think of, I guess, is that these themes and these monuments and Confederate monuments are not relegated to just Confederate monuments from this time period. They're also present in other monuments that are constructed at this time. So I'm thinking especially of folks from like the North or whatever, they're like, this is all that Southern stuff. We don't have these issues. Who Malcolm X, if nobody else was like, no, it's not going to be that simple. And so a classic example of this is the Emancipation Monument in DC, which has Lincoln standing over top of a crouching naked black man. Lincoln standing with his arm over him, and the man is crouching almost completely naked. And he's emancipating him. But this thing aesthetically, it's all the same notes as whiteness as superior, whiteness as paternalistically gifting something, black folks as in a position of reception, and all that kind of stuff. So it's more deeply embedded in the whole of the country than just the South. And I wouldn't want people to think, this is some Southern problem. Like, no, that, would that it was. What's an ellipsis?
Oh, I was just saying that, hopefully we get to hear more from you in the coming, since our session's going to end soon, maybe we can all read the book and there's so much to process to be able to be armed with your manuscript next time we ask you questions.
Yeah. If anyone is interested, there's a discount. I can send it to you discount code, but I wouldn't expect anyone to have to do that.
I think it's interesting as you were talking about this, when we begin to think about our own sanctuaries and our own houses of worship, and how much intentionality there is in the shape of those buildings and the ways and practices, and if we're not attentive to those, how quickly they can not reflect what they're intended to reflect.
I mean, Jill Cranshaw would be all over that. In fact, didn't she used to have, our teacher from Wake, didn't she used to have like collections of church building pictures she's taken of different church buildings and architecture and liturgies? I mean, that absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. In fact, basically what I've done here is, I had never thought about this, but I probably should talk to her about that. Like the very moves, we're in the same class that she did with liturgies and Christian churches, architecture. It's like the same kind of thing that's going on.
Which I never paid any attention to until she brought it to mind. And some of the same thing that you're saying with these statues,
yes.
When you can't, like once you see the theology in it, it's hard to unsee it.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it's the same move of like, there's what's said, there's like the text, and then there's like the subtext, and then there's this context around it. So, and that's what sometimes can happen, is that people they only pay attention to one or the other, and miss what's being done by way of what is said, or not just what's present, but what's not present. So in terms of church, planning or whatever, it's not just what's there, but what's not there or never there, never talked about. I mean, I'm not trying to.
Right.
Pastor Bob. Yeah, you know what I'm saying? So,
yeah.
And the goal being, I mean, Jill would always talk about this, the goal isn't then no liturgy or no architecture or something. The goal is better, counter, finding ways to, I don't know, mess with that in the ways that are there most of the time, a lot of the time. So the idea that humans are going to be non-liturgically formed people, non-ritually formed, not shaped by our stuff around us. I mean, that's one kind of very American response to this kind of a talk, is just to go, well, in my own head, I'm going to grit my teeth and I won't be affected by this stuff. I'm the master of my fate. I'm the captain of my ship, and it's just, no, that's the fool's errand. Whether you realize it or not, we're going to be shaped by this constellation of images we've got in our cityscapes. So the question is not if, it's how, Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I've got a lot to think about.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for listening and asking questions. I appreciate it, honestly. I was nervous.
Thank
you very
much.
much.
Great.
Yeah,
and
that was
thanks
awesome.
for joining us. It was
Thank you
really
so
neat.
much.
For those of you who probably don't know, this is one of the first times Ryan has presented this stuff in a group to folks. So we're a test run in many ways. So I'm grateful for you being willing to kind of share this with us and get started on it. So it's
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next time I'm in Charlotte, come by.
Come see us, please do.
Thank you, Ryan.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night. Night.
Good night.
How do you leave this thing?